What would you say if a cop walked up to you and said, "Give me your ID right now"? If you say the wrong thing, you can give away rights you did not know you had. If you refuse the wrong way, you can turn a simple encounter into handcuffs fast. Before I reveal the exact words, hit subscribe so you can find this video again when you actually need it. Smash like right now because this one mistake happens in seconds. You need to know something right away. There is no one-size-fits-all answer here. If you are driving, the rules are different than if you are walking down the street. If you are a passenger, that is different too. And if the officer is just asking questions with no legal reason to hold you, that changes everything. Let me show you exactly how to tell the difference in real time. You are about to learn the first question that tells you whether this is a real detention or just a fishing trip. You are going to learn when you do have to identify yourself, when you usually do not, and how to answer without sounding scared, angry, or guilty. Most people have no idea that one calm sentence can stop an entire chain of bad decisions before it starts. Here is why this gets so dangerous so fast. The second an officer says, "Give me your ID," your brain splits in two directions. One part wants to obey instantly, the other part wants to challenge everything. Both can get you in trouble if you do them blindly. If you hand over ID when the officer had no right to demand it, you may turn a voluntary chat into something much bigger. If you refuse when the law does require it, you may give the officer a reason to escalate. That is why you need a script, not a guess. I've analyzed over 200 body cam videos, and the pattern is always the same. Drivers and pedestrians get into trouble when they react emotionally instead of forcing the officer to define the stop. The first tactic is simple, and it matters most when you are on foot. You do not start by arguing. You do not start by saying, "I know my rights." You start by forcing clarity. You look at the officer and say this: "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to leave?" Those exact words. Memorize that line. Why does that line work so well? Because not every police encounter is a legal detention. Sometimes an officer is just trying to get you talking. If you are truly free to leave, then the officer does not get to treat a casual chat like a command scene. United States versus Mendenhall gave a simple test. If a reasonable person would not feel free to walk away, then it is a seizure. Plain English. If the officer's words, tone, or actions make it feel like you cannot leave, then the law treats it differently. Brown versus Texas also matters here. The Supreme Court said police cannot just grab someone and demand identification without real objective reasons to stop that person. Plain English. They need more than a hunch. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Why do you need my ID? I didn't do anything." Then the officer hears attitude, the encounter gets hotter, and now you are arguing before you even know the rules. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to leave?" Then the officer has to show his hand and define the encounter. Watch what happens when you use that question the right way. If the officer says you are free to leave, the game is over. You walk away calmly, no story, no ID, no extra questions. If the officer says you are detained, now the stop has legal weight and you can move to your next line. That is why this first question is so powerful. It does not accuse anyone. It does not escalate. It forces clarity. Defense attorneys use this exact line in court because it shows you were trying to understand your status, not create a scene. And do not miss the deeper point here. You are not refusing everything. You are sorting the encounter into the right box. Voluntary or detained, casual or compulsory, friendly request or legal command. That one question keeps you from guessing. It also keeps you from giving up your privacy just because an officer sounded confident. Here's the reality. Confidence from an officer does not equal legal duty for you. Your job is not to debate on the sidewalk. Your job is to find out what box you are in, then respond the right way from there. Have you ever been stopped and honestly had no idea if you were free to leave? Drop a comment below because that confusion is exactly what gets people trapped. The second tactic kicks in if the officer says you are detained and still demands your ID. Now you need a calm line that does two things at once. It shows respect and it makes the officer tell you the legal basis. Here's exactly what you say. "Officer, if I am legally required to identify myself, I will comply. What law requires it here?" Word for word, keep your voice even, keep your hands visible, then wait. Here's the trick they don't want you knowing. In some states, during a lawful stop, you may have to give your name. That came up in Hiibel versus Sixth Judicial District Court. The Supreme Court said a state can require a person to identify himself during a valid stop if state law says so. Plain English, if the stop is lawful and the state has that kind of law, you may have to identify yourself. But Hiibel did not say you must answer every other question. It did not say you have to explain where you are going, what you are doing, who you were with, or why you are in the area. That is the part many people miss. So why use that line? Because it makes the officer tell you whether this is a real legal requirement or just pressure. Former police officers have confirmed this works because it shows calm cooperation without blind surrender. If there is a real law in play, you can decide how to comply. If there is not, the officer now knows you are not going to volunteer extra information. Bad way. Most drivers say, "No, I'm not giving you anything. You can't make me." Then the officer hears flat refusal, the tension spikes, and you may get arrested even if the stop was weak. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, if I am legally required to identify myself, I will comply." What law requires it here? Then the officer has to explain the legal basis instead of bluffing through the moment. This is where you stay very careful. You are not trying to win a courtroom battle on the curb. You are not trying to humiliate the officer. You are trying to make the officer commit to a reason. If the officer names a state law and the stop is lawful, you may choose to identify yourself. If the officer cannot explain the basis and starts shifting around, that tells you something too. Legal experts agree this is your strongest protection because it separates lawful commands from casual demands. And after that, you keep your mouth shut about everything else. If you do identify yourself, that does not mean you need to tell your whole story. You can say, "I choose to remain silent." You can say, "I do not want to answer questions." Hiibel was about identity, not your whole life. This comes straight from Supreme Court rulings. The law can force narrow things in narrow moments. It does not turn you into a witness against yourself just because the officer wants a conversation. The third tactic is where people mess up the worst because street advice gets mixed up with traffic stop rules. If you are driving, do not use pedestrian advice. During a lawful traffic stop, you generally do have to produce your driver's license and basic vehicle documents. So if the officer says, "Give me your ID" during a traffic stop, your smartest line is not a refusal. Your smartest line is this: "Officer, here is my license. I do not wish to answer questions." Short, clean, repeatable. Listen closely because this is critical. Driving is regulated differently than walking down the street. Delaware versus Prouse said police cannot randomly stop drivers just to check licenses with no reason at all. Plain English. They need a valid reason for the stop or a lawful checkpoint system, not pure whim. But once you have been lawfully stopped, you do not improve your situation by refusing to hand over your license. That usually makes things worse. The better move is to comply with the document part and refuse the talking part. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Sure, officer, here's my license. I'm coming from my friend's house. I only had one beer." Then the officer now has your ID, your story, and your admission. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, here is my license. I do not wish to answer questions." Then the officer gets the required document, but not the extra evidence. That line works because it separates the mandatory part from the optional part. You are handling the legal duty without feeding the investigation. Berkemer versus McCarty matters here too. The Supreme Court said normal roadside questioning during a traffic stop is usually not full custody for Miranda purposes. Plain English. Do not wait for TV rights to save you. Protect yourself before you start talking. If you keep trying to sound helpful, you can hand over the very facts that build suspicion. Watch what happens when a driver does the wrong version. The officer asks for license and registration. The driver hands them over and starts filling the silence. Now the officer knows where the driver says he came from, who he says he was with, whether he says he drank, and whether his timeline makes sense. If one detail changes later, the officer calls it a lie. If the driver stays disciplined, the officer has much less to work with. This is 100% legal. You can comply with the document request and still refuse to answer investigative questions. Still watching? Good. Drop a like if this is already changing how you think about every traffic stop you've ever had. The fourth tactic is what you say after the officer has your ID and tries to turn one request into a full-blown investigation. This is where the stop often stretches. The officer checks your license, comes back, then keeps pushing. Where are you headed? Who owns the car? Mind if I search? Why are you nervous? That is when you use the closing line that keeps the stop from drifting. You say, "Officer, am I free to leave? If not, I want to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." That is the full line. Practice it until it feels boring. Why does this matter? Because once the traffic mission is done, the officer does not get unlimited extra time just to fish around. Rodriguez versus United States said police cannot extend a traffic stop longer than needed for the traffic work unless they have separate legal reasons. Plain English, the stop is for the stop, not for endless side quests. If the officer keeps you there to chase unrelated suspicions without legal grounds, that can matter later. But your job in that moment is not to argue case names. Your job is to lock down your words and refuse consent. Bad way. Most drivers say, I guess you can look if you want. I've got nothing to hide. Then the officer gets consent, the search starts, and your protection shrinks fast. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, am I free to leave? If not, I want to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." Then the officer has to either end the stop or carry the legal burden without your help. Here's the reality. Many people lose not because the officer had a strong case, but because they kept talking after the required part was over. They stay standing there, they keep answering, they try to explain why they are innocent. That instinct feels natural, but it is risky. If you are free to go, leave. If you are not free to go, stop feeding the encounter. This is 100% legal. You are not obstructing by refusing consent. You are not being disrespectful by asking if you are free to go. You are protecting yourself in a clean, calm, lawful way. If you've made it this far, you're serious about protecting your rights. Show me by hitting that like button because the legal framework coming next is the part almost nobody knows. Now let's make the law simple. Brown versus Texas says police cannot detain you and demand identification just because they feel suspicious in a vague way. They need specific facts. In kid-level English, they need a real reason, not a guess. That backs up your first line about asking whether you are detained or free to leave. Hiibel says that during a lawful stop, a state may require you to identify yourself if the law says so. In simple English, sometimes you may have to give your name, but that does not mean you owe the officer your whole story. That backs up your second line about asking what law requires identification here. Delaware versus Prouse says police cannot randomly pull over drivers just to check licenses with no proper reason. In simple English, they do not get to stop cars on a whim. And Rodriguez says a traffic stop cannot be stretched longer than needed just to go fishing. In simple English, the stop has a job, and once that job is done, the officer needs a real reason to keep you there. Put those together and the picture gets clear. First, find out if this is a real detention. Second, if the officer claims you must identify yourself, make him state the basis. Third, if you are driving, comply with the license request but not the extra questioning. Fourth, once the mission is over, ask if you are free to leave and refuse consent to searches. Now picture a real traffic stop at night. You get pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer walks up and says, "Give me your ID." The wrong way starts immediately. You dig through your wallet, hand over your license, and start talking. You say you are coming from a party, but you only had one drink. The officer hears the word party and the word drink. He asks more. Your voice gets shaky. He asks if there is anything illegal in the car. You say no, search it if you want. Now the stop is no longer about a taillight. It is about everything you just handed him. Now the right way, you keep your hands visible. You say, "Officer, here is my license. I do not wish to answer questions." He takes it and runs your information. He comes back and starts again. "Where are you coming from tonight?" You do not fill the silence. You say, "I want to remain silent." He hands back your license but keeps talking and asks if he can search the car. You say, "Officer, am I free to leave? If not, I want to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." That answer does three things. It checks whether the stop is over, it shuts down more questioning, and it blocks easy consent. If you were on foot instead of driving, your opening line would have been different. You would start with, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to leave?" Same calm tone, same purpose. Find out the legal box before you give anything away. Coming next week, what to do when cops ask to search your phone. Subscribe because that video could save your whole private life from getting exposed. So lock in the 4 lines. First, if you are on foot, ask whether you are being detained or free to leave. Second, if the officer says you must identify yourself, ask what law requires it here. Third, if you are driving, hand over your license but refuse the extra questions. Fourth, once the stop drifts past the basics, ask if you are free to leave and clearly refuse searches. You do not need a speech. You need a few calm sentences you can actually remember under pressure. Hit subscribe so you catch that phone search video next week. Smash like if this just gave you a script you can actually use. And drop a comment telling me which line you are going to memorize first. Stay safe out there.